I guess in my 52-year railroad career, I have walked to the moon and back on railroad platforms just like this in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And I've come to know there are a lot of untold stories and even a few secrets out there involving the railroad industry. Please join us and subscribe so we can continue to bring you those untold stories and even a few secrets from America's railroad past.
All aboard! Highball it, Eagle!
Have you heard the travel news about the Eagle Way? To your destination happening every day. The Texas Eagle is clicking on the rail. From the Windy City to the Alamo, meet you at the station, come on, let's go. People get ready and catch the wave. Catch the wave, the Texas Eagle Way. Through the heart of the nation.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again to my podcast, I've Seen Some Trains Before. Griff Hubbard here with you again, and so happy you've joined us today for what is going to be a real treat in a historical presentation and preservation of musical history. And who would have ever thunk it, but the origins of boogie woogie music are rooted deeply in Northeast Texas, specifically between Texarkana, Marshall, Longview, and Big Sandy. Who would have ever thought that? But we have a gentleman here today who's going to tell us how that is indeed reality and how he has proven it for the historical record. Our guest today is no stranger to the historical or musical world, Dr. John Tennison of San Antonio, Texas, a board-certified forensic psychiatrist. But we're very grateful, I'm very grateful, that your side interest is history, and in this particular case, railroad history. Mm-hmm. So, Doc, we're talking about the roots of the music that influenced the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard and on and on. Is that correct?
Yes, all of the above and many others. The musical genre known as boogie woogie was very much a influence of rock and roll, especially 1950s rock and roll. So the English bands, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, certainly have cited boogie woogie as being an influence on them in some of their early music, American music that they heard that influenced them. And boogie woogie more generally, if you look at the first inductees into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, pretty much every one of them has cited boogie woogie as being a major influence and can be quoted as such.
Wow. I mean, you just don't think of Northeast Texas as being the birthplace. And it's my understanding that this is rooted as far back as the 1870s. Is that correct?
Yes. So boogie woogie music has been, as far as the question of, where did boogie woogie come from? What was the origin of boogie woogie? That was being researched at least as early as the 1930s. And by the late 1930s, the researchers who had looked into the matter concluded that it had come from East Texas. And in particular, the early 1870s have been cited as the time frame when boogie woogie was first played, but not more specific than that. So by early 1870s, prior to 1875, after 1870, sometime in that range. But after having looked into it, I think that the year 1873 is probably the most likely year that boogie woogie was first played. At least, it really just reached an exponential curve, I think, at that point. And that would mean that last year, 2023, would have been the sesquicentennial of the first time that boogie woogie was played.
And are we safe to assume, I know you have a wonderful slideshow presentation that is going to flesh this out, ladies and gentlemen, in more historical detail, but I think it's safe to say of the major railroads of East Texas of that time, the Missouri Pacific Railroad, the Texas and Pacific Railway, the Kansas City Southern Lines, the Louisiana and Arkansas, and the International and Great Northern, I think it's historically safe to say that boogie woogie had its roots on the Texas and Pacific Railway. Is that correct?
I would definitely, of those mentioned, I would definitely attribute boogie woogie and identify boogie woogie mostly and virtually exclusively with the Texas and Pacific, in that it was boogie woogie to the extent that it came from the Northeast Texas area. The Texas and Pacific Railroad would have been the predominant railroad associated with that and with those routes which the itinerant musicians took. And as they developed the routes and laid new track, that created new routes where that music could spread. And so that's why I've come to call the Texas Pacific Railroad the Boogie Woogie Railroad.
Okay. All right. Sir, why don't we go through your slideshow here and we will comment as you make your presentation, if that format fits your...
Sure, absolutely. So I have a slideshow that I prepared for Longview. In particular, we're in Longview now. And there is a Longview connection in that the first north-south corridor from Texarkana down to Houston in Texas went from Texarkana to Marshall over to Longview, then down to Houston. And that's why this is titled Boogie Woogie, the Longview Connection. And first, though, let me backtrack a little bit and address the question, what is Boogie Woogie? It's kind of a silly-sounding name, Boogie Woogie. It sounds even like a childish nursery rhyme, but it is really the music that we are already familiar with. It's, if you think of 1950s rock and roll piano players like Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard, and the kind of stuff they would do, that was Boogie Woogie music. The purest form being, solo piano music. So you might have a bass figure on a piano that's something like, and then a right-hand part. So stuff like that, glissandos, but that kind of that ostinato or repeating left-hand part with all sorts of staccato and often loud right-hand parts and glissandos. That's all Boogie Woogie. So,
question. From my railroad background, I always heard of steam locomotive rhythms referred to as staccato stack talk, meaning the smoke coming. Is that a connection here to Boogie Woogie?
I think certainly the puffs, the chuffs that you see coming out of the smokestack, those are synchronized. Those occurred at the same time with the turning of the big driver wheel. So one thing you can see visually here is that for every 4 chuffs, like 1, 2, 3, 4, there was a full turn of the driver wheels, and that is regarded as having influenced the left hand of early Boogie Woogie bass figures, which were 4-part bass figures essentially. So you had like 1, 2, 3, and the chuffs were staccato, and that you get a staccato means as opposed to like a connected. Staccato would be kind of like that. So the chuffs do have that quality.
That is really incredible. I want to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. So what you're saying is, steam locomotives were often referred to as living beings because of their quirkiness, and I mean, and indeed they were in a way. Living behemoths,
a dragon on the track or something.
Yes. But what I hear you telling me is that the motion and rhythm and sounds of steam engines on the Texas and Pacific Railway got transmitted to a piano keyboard. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's the widely.
That's just incredible.
Yes, that's believed to be that incessant sound of those who worked around trains in the development of the track systems and the lumber yards, anywhere that there, or in a place like Marshall, Texas, where there were stations, there were depot, where anywhere where there was more train traffic, where you had multiple locomotives, you had that incessant sound. And I think human beings are imitative creatures. So if we hear a sound over and over, like if you're sitting at the intersection, your windshield wipers going, you might start.
Oh yeah, makes perfect sense.
Yes, people tend to create rhythms. It's a human pastime. But so the people who worked at these early camps are believed to have been influenced by the steam locomotives, and that's corroborated time and time again over multiple sources.
Okay, please continue with the presentation.
Sure. So Boogie Woogie is a piano music. It has an ostinato bass figure, which ostinato is a musical term for repeating. So it might be repeating like that. Or it could be repeating in a walking bass figure like. And so forth. But it's not so much that it repeats, but it's non-stopping. The left hand never stops in Boogie Woogie. And the easiest way to do that as a human being is to learn a pattern so well that you don't have to think about it, and you can kind of automatically play it with muscle memory while more consciously, usually focusing on the right-hand part. Which also has a lot of movement. But so that's one aspect of Boogie Woogie music, but it was also a dance music. And this slide, as you can see, says the modern form of dance we call Boogie Woogie is largely a 20th century invention, but even the early Boogie Woogie the music of Boogie Woogie was being used as dance music, but it wasn't so much like Lindy Hop or swing music. It was more sensual, booty shaking music and stuff you might see at a juke joint, like twerking and things of that. So what in modern days is called twerking.
Wow.
So that's a major. The pelvic movements of twerking is a major part of the dance vocabulary of Boogie Woogie music. And
I had no idea.
it was being done in Boogie Woogie before. In fact, the earliest album I've ever found that used the term New Orleans bounce was actually predominantly a Boogie Woogie album.
So young folk who think they are twerking a new step are now surprised to find out they're twerking their ancestors' steps.
Well, yes, and these movements, I mean, these can be seen in African cultures as well. The dance vocabulary involving the pelvic movements is certainly not a modern phenomenon, and of course that's recognized by some artists as well. But I was talking to the New Orleans bounce artist Big Frida in Austin, and she was in agreement with me that yes, this is definitely an older dance vocabulary than what's in modern days called bounce music.
Wow.
But yeah, it's a very sensual music because it was used it was first played in these lumber camps where there was gambling, drinking, prostitution, and it was really kind of a soundtrack of the sinful behaviors, that the men and any women who might have come around were engaging in, and the dance vocabulary reflected that as well. Amazing.
Please continue.
Sure. So ostinato being one factor of that, but. Let me backtrack a little bit. This is actually a trivia game. It was a Texarkana trivia card of a game that came out in 1985.
Question. Okay, tell us this story. This is, if I'm not mistaken now, because I want this to be historically accurate.
Sure.
This is how you first got interested in the origin of Boogie Woogie music?
Yes.
Okay, tell us that story.
Yes, and to be clear, I was playing rudimentary Boogie Woogie growing up and learning more and more over the years, but I never really thought much about the origin of Boogie Woogie. But in the 1980s in Texarkana, the Trivial Pursuit was a popular game nationwide.
Correct.
And Texarkana had its own version of a Texarkana trivia game.
I have one of them.
Oh, yeah, as do I. And this card was like the most influential card for me because one of the, just like Trivial Pursuit, you had the four categories as you do in Trivial Pursuit. And the green category, the third question says the term blank is supposed to have originated in Texarkana during the 1890 to 1930 era of music. The answer to the card being boogie. And that intrigued me. I said, wow, I did not know that. And I started asking around, and I learned that a man named Wilbur Smith, who, if people don't know, is your great uncle.
Correct.
And it was known as Mr. Texarkana.
He was yes.
regarded by J.Q. Mahaffey, the former editor of the Texarkana Gazette, as being the foremost historian of Texarkana.
Yes, sir.
And he contributed a lot of the knowledge and questions and ideas from which questions were generated in this game. So I started talking with Wilbur Smith extensively in 1985, as well as one of my own mentors, Lee Reese Sullivan, and other people I could find. And they were able to elaborate beyond simply what this question indicated in terms of the use of the word boogie and when they had first heard it in the area, as well as piano music that sounded like modern examples or 20th century examples of boogie woogie.
And you have called it boogie woogie another term that I had never heard before. If you could say it again, I can't pronounce it.
Well, yes, it's kind of a phonetically correct way of saying it. Blind Lemon Jefferson, who was known for playing the guitar, he, prior to Pine Top Smith's famous 1929 recording where the term boogie woogie was used in the title of the audio recording, which was pressed on a record, Blind Lemon Jefferson, it was phonetically transcribed as boogarooga, like Boogarooga.
Boogarooga.
Yeah,
okay.
But it could very well be that was simply his way phonetically of saying boogie woogie. But it was also, it had other meanings. Like boogarooga was like a name for a wild party. Like, I'm going to hold a boogarooga at my house tonight.
Okay.
But that term boogarooga was being used by Blind Lemon Jefferson several years prior to when Pine Top Smith put it in his recording, but or used it in the recording. But my interviews with Wilbur Smith indicated that his father, William Smith,
my great-grandfather,
your great-grandfather, yes, who was a Texas and Pacific engineer, had heard the term being used in the Buchanan community of Bowie County, which is far south Bowie County, just a little bit over the Sulphur River. But
William Buchanan, famous Southern pioneer lumberman.
Yes, yeah, right. So it was named after the lumber, and there was no doubt a lumber enterprise there, but there was also a T&P depot.
Yes.
And although I never met your great-grandfather, but Wilbur said that his great-grandfather had said the terms boogie and boogie-woogie were being used for piano music by African Americans in the Buchanan community. But he could not say.
What year do you think?
It would have been the 1890s. 1890s. So I think it was the early 1890s is what he said or what I inferred, but 1890s for sure. So that is the word boogie was around in the 1800s, but in terms of boogeyman, and there was music, there was sheet music that had the term boogeyman in the title, but it was not dissociated from the idea of this scary person. And indeed the African Americans.
So the boogeyman was not someone to fear.
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
There was a literature in which the boogeyman was portrayed as this fearful thing that would, especially towards children who would come and take them away if they were bad kids. But it's also possible that the idea of a boogeyman got conflated with a black man playing boogie woogie music, because to the extent that might have been a threatening image or a threatening idea to the more conservative white community. So in some ways, it's possible that the etymology of boogie woogie music might have borrowed from boogeyman because of the use, because of the meaning of that kind of something scary, at least to the white community. And there's a lot more to the etymology than that, but there's also a Cherokee Native American boogie. It's actually called the boogie dance, but it actually uses the term as well that suggests that etymology, there might be something to that etymology.
Wow, so there's a flavor of social justice in these origins.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, it certainly was a music of freedom. I mean, the music, in the sense that the newly emancipated African Americans in 1865 could exhibit the freedom of improvisation, the freedom of not following the rules of Western harmony, and still making wonderful music, and it is very liberating for sure.
All right, so back to the origins of your interest. You found this card in the Texarkana version of Trivial Pursuit, and you took it from there, and you began to seek out people who could tell you more, and take it from there. Yeah, so at first locally, and just to summarize, this is a picture, by the way, of Wilbur Smith. This is 1948. Of course, what I was not born until 1968, so I never knew him at this age of his life, but I just had a couple of pictures here. And this is what I said a moment ago. He said that his father, whose full name William Arthur Smith, had heard the terms boogie and boogie woogie being used to refer to piano music in the Buchanan community. But Wilbur was not able to say, what, nor I assume that William Arthur Smith did not tell him, or maybe didn't know, what was it boogie woogie music? Was it something that sounded different? We don't know. But well, in the, if I can add historical context here, because I know of my great-grandfather's railroad history, William Arthur Smith, in the 1890s, he would have been in regular passenger service, actually mixed train, meaning combination of freight and passenger cars, on the Texarkana, Shreveport, and Natchez between Texarkana and Shreveport. Interesting. And then by the turn of the century, meaning the 1900s, he would have been on the passenger trains 31 and 32 on the Transcontinental Division between Texarkana and Fort Worth. That's the route that went through New Boston and Paris and Bonham and Denton and on to Fort Worth. So my great-grandfather would have had an opportunity to have heard music on both of those routes in his working career. Interesting. And do you know if he had any experience on that route personally from Texarkana, the one that went south to Marshall? Did he have any? No, he was a T&P engineer on the Transcontinental Division, and they did not hold seniority on quote unquote the main line. Interesting. Marshall to Longview to Mineola to Dallas Fort Worth, but they did hold seniority between Texarkana and Shreveport, and Texarkana and Fort Worth. And that raises an interesting question. That if to the extent that he identifies boogie and boogie woogie as being at the Buchanan Depot, I'm wondering if that was his personal experience or if it was by secondhand report, because I don't know. Well, don't forget in the 1890s, if you were going over the Transcontinental Division to Fort Worth, you would have come in very close proximity to the Buchanan station. Interesting. Okay. Because you would have left Texarkana and come out through Nash. Okay.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. I want to look more into that. So that raises new questions for me as well. In terms of what experience? Do you think he was a passenger or had maybe other capacity on the train other than engineer between Texarkana and Marshall?
Well, I do have an educated guess on this. His father-in-law, my great-great-grandfather, Colonel Lyman Stacy Roach, was a mainline engineer who regularly called at Buchanan Station. So you see, he could have heard that anecdotally from his father-in-law.
Could have come from Lyman Roach.
Could have come from, because Lyman Roach would have been calling daily, calling meaning stopping his passenger train at Buchanan Station on a daily basis from 1879 to 1885.
Interesting. Which would even predate the 90s. Yeah. So who knows? So that raises even more questions that we might never have answers for. But
right.
But it's certainly worth looking into. And there are certainly other boogie woogie milestones or base figures that are associated with that transcontinental division as well as the Shreveport to Texarkana division.
Well, you are the historian here. I'm not qualified to know the answer to this question, but you are. I'm going to take a guess that Buchanan Depot, as the crow flies, could not have been that many miles from Nash. It
was certainly Bowie County. I think it. If you look at the stop, like the Moore's Landing right over the Sulphur River in southern Bowie County, I think the next station up was Buchanan.
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, so it would be just a few miles.
Right.
But I don't know how many. I'd have to look at the map.
So I guess what I'm really asking, the same group of people that were pounding out the new sounds on the piano at Buchanan Station probably were doing the same thing at Nash.
That's right. If there was a venue at Nash, the itinerant musicians would certainly have known about it and likely have been playing through at both locations.
Right.
That's true.
Right. Please proceed.
Sure.
This is fascinating.
Oh, well, thank you. This is a picture of William Arthur Smith, Buchanan, the father of Wilbur Smith.
Yeah, my great-grandfather.
Your great-grandfather. And then I have this other picture that this is one of him in the cab. You can't see his face quite as well, but that's the engine 332.
Correct.
So do you know where that was taken by any chance?
I do. That would have been a yard engine. He would have been working in Texarkana Yard on that locomotive.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't take note of that. So the other thing I asked Wilbur Smith about in 1915 was what had he personally experienced. And he, as you know, he was at a youngster, probably under 15 years of age. He had a job of collecting coins from the player pianos of the brothels in Texarkana near this.
And he loved to tell that story about himself.
There are amazing things that I've interviews that I've heard about him at his actual voice speaking of things that happened. But he says that not only that certainly the word boogie and boogie woogie were being used, but also did remember enough of the piano music to be able to corroborate that it did sound similar, in his opinion, to what's known as Pinetop's Boogie Woogie, which was a sample of, I don't have it with me today, but it was a sample of music I played from the 1929 recording by Pinetop Smith. So, how similar it was, who knows, but certainly those elements would have been around prior to 1929. You're
so musically accomplished, and I apologize for putting you on the spot, but I bet you can do this. Can you give us a brief sample of Pinetop Boogie?
Well, basically, there are right-handed motifs that I don't memorize, but it's basically the things that would suggest Pinetop would be the bass figures that just that sort of bass figure. And there's other right-handed motifs that are associated specifically with Pinetop's Boogie Woogie that I don't have memorized. But
so that's the sound my great uncle would have heard in the brothels, the red light district.
It's something similar to that. He wasn't sure. What he said was it did sound similar to that in style. So in the sense of having a kind of a walking or ostinato bass figure, and then sort of right-handed embellishments on top of that.
Okay.
So, and I think it might be possible to let the listeners hear Pinetop's Boogie Woogie, since I can't play it competently right now. I can play it, but I don't have it memorized. So that would be a good thing to let people hear, because that is the earliest audio recording that has an unequivocal Boogie Woogie identity, that you can say, okay, this is definitely Boogie Woogie, and other things are Boogie Woogie, kind of compared to how similar they are to that.
For our viewers, as you well know, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Tennison and I are friends other than just associates here on this podcast. So Dr. Tennison already knows that I'm technically illiterate. So am I misspeaking if I say you could probably Google Pine Top Boogie or look on YouTube and be able to hear, so that our listeners will have a source of where they may hear it?
Oh, definitely, yes. It's very pervasive. It's on a lot of song compilations. It's a Pine Top's Boogie Woogie, and it's Pine Top is 2 words, P-I-N space T-O-P.
Okay.
It's usually not, and also Boogie Woogie is 2 words. That's the other thing. The original spelling of Boogie Woogie, that's an fascinating thing actually. That dictionaries will say to hyphenate it, but if you look at all professional instances of the use of the word boogie woogie, the vast majority of them do not hyphenate it. So I don't either. I keep the space there.
Got it.
It's 4 words, Pine Top's Boogie Woogie, recorded in December of 1928, but released in 29. And right after 29, right in January, I think it was January 29, he got killed. So he died shortly after the recording was released.
Wow, okay.
But yeah, there are like 2 or 3 different takes or versions of it that are out there. But any one of them was sufficient.
And who wrote Pine Top Boogie?
Well, Pine Top Smith wrote it.
Okay, and he was a native of, or where did
he was originally from Alabama, and he spent time in Pittsburgh. I think he might have been influenced to give him the name of Boogie Woogie, but he was born in 1904. So he's at least a second generation Boogie Woogie player. Interesting, there were other people called Pine Top who played Boogie Woogie in the Arklatex area even before him. There was 1 or 2 in the Shreveport area.
Okay.
So the name Pine Top is a name that recurs in blues music, in piano music specifically. So Pine Top Smith was not the first Pine Top, and after him there was Pine Top Perkins who eventually ended up in Austin, and he was still playing it like in his 90s. I think he died at 97 years old.
Pine Top probably being a reference to the East Texas pines?
Well, certainly to Pine Tops, and if to the extent that name originated in East Texas or the Arklatex, it would have been about the pines in this area. Now, we know why it was at Pine Top as opposed to Pine Bottom or Pine anything else. We don't really know, but some people say that someone's hair might have looked like the top of a pine, or maybe they climbed a pine tree at some point. There's all sorts of speculations, but I don't think it's really known how that came about, how that name came about.
Mm-hmm. Proceed, please.
It's one of those many obscure things about Boogie Woogie. So there's a picture of Wilbur circa 1920. He would have been even younger than this, of course, when he had the job of collecting the coins from the player pianos in the brothels.
You know, a little known fact about him, if I might interject, since this is a railroad history podcast, he was a Cotton Belt Railroad traffic manager during World War II.
Oh, wow.
A St. Louis Southwestern Railway. So he continued the family railroad routes, at least during the war years.
Interesting. Well, yeah, and your family, so much railroadiana, if I can say that, if that's the right term, just...
that is the right term.
I love all the things you have collected. It's amazing. And so let's see. So this is just a summary, really, of the last 2 points. Is that number 1, in the 1890s, the word boogie and boogie woogie were reported to have been used in the Buchanan community to refer to piano music, and then also later, by no later than 1915, the same terms were used to describe music that did have similarities to what we think of as boogie woogie today. So that just summarizes those last 2 points. And this gets back to what I was talking about in terms of the influence of boogie woogie on rock and roll pertaining to the question you asked. These are just a few of the quotes, but you can see here that Chuck Berry said, "The nature and backbone of my beat is boogie, and the muscle of my music is melodies that are simple. Call it what you may, jazz, jump, swing, soul, rhythm, rock, or even punk. It's still boogie so far as I'm connected with it. When I can't connect to it, I have no right to dispute its title. When it's boogie, but with an alien title, the connection is still boogie and my kind of music." That was Chuck Berry in his autobiography. Little Richard said it more succinctly. He said, "Everything I play is boogie woogie. Rock and roll is just up-tempo boogie woogie." And Jerry Lee Lewis once said it was one of the radio programs, he said, "They called it blues, they called it boogie woogie, then they changed the name of it to rock and roll." So, blues and boogie can sometimes be synonyms. I would say that not all boogie woogie is blues, but a lot of boogie woogie would also classify as blues music, but not all of it.
Well, okay.
But what is and is not blues is another complicated topic. So let me see what I have next here. So that brings us to Marshall, Texas. Shall I go into discuss Marshall a little bit?
Yeah, tell us. I believe you were explaining to me, and please don't let me misspeak. I know you won't. for your historical research, Marshall is just a geographical representation of where Boogie Woogie could have originated.
It's and the way I like to say it is that the reason I call Marshall the birthplace of Boogie Woogie, which is what it's come to be known as, is that in my opinion, Marshall is the most likely municipality to have been at the center of gravity in the early 1870s when the first Boogie Woogies were played. So I don't have evidence that Boogie Woogie was specifically played in the city limits of Marshall or at some specific intersection or anything like that. But when I look at the reports of when Boogie Woogie was played and the elements it was associated with, and also the era of the early 1870s, there's no other municipality that seems more likely than Marshall to have been at that center of gravity.
Well, let's think about this for a moment. You know, I think you're absolutely right here, because if Boogie Woogie had its origins from the sounds and rhythms of railroading, the only place in East Texas in the very early 1870s that really had a heavy railroad presence would have been Marshall, Texas.
Yes, yeah, and that's exactly why I concluded. Not having been from Marshall, I was led to Marshall by that exact consideration.
Okay.
Not just because it was a locus of railroad traffic, but because the Harrison County African American population was among the largest in Texas. It was in the piney woods, and it was in an area where lumbering and railroad camps were constructing railroads and were using a lot of black labor. And so that's all of those elements seem to be most strongly represented in the Harrison County area, of which Marshall kind of was the headquarters. So there was the incessant sound of the steam locomotive. There would have been more cross traffic and more steam locomotives coming into contact and crossing each other, one going one way, one going the other way, in Marshall than any one location. If you think about you would have encountered more locomotives in Marshall than any one other spot outside of Marshall. If that makes sense.
I say that makes perfect sense. Yes.
Yeah, so that's I came to call Marshall the birthplace of Boogie Woogie, which is really the municipal unit, if you will, is kind of is a convention. We talk about cities. People talk about New Orleans being the birthplace of jazz. No one knows that the first jazz was played in New Orleans. Some people think it was played in Donaldsonville, west of New Orleans, or somewhere outside the city limits. But we do know that New Orleans came to have a lot of jazz played there, such that calling it the birthplace as a summary statement makes sense. So it's really that convention that I could call Marshall the birthplace of Boogie Woogie. But if you take it literally and say, oh yeah, well, tell me the exact block and intersection building that had happened in Marshall, that's not the claim. It's just really as a center of gravity. So that's I guess helpful to be understood to know that. But as a consequence of this research, this Texas Historical Commission ultimately came to agree with that designation, and this was a historical plaque or marker that was placed in Marshall in 2018. It was actually approved, I think, in 2013, but it took several years for them to find a location for it. But they found a great location, which is between the old Janacchio Hotel and the Texas and Pacific Depot in Marshall. And so this is very visible. There's now a restaurant in the Janacchio Hotel, so a lot of people who come to that restaurant or who are walking to the depot can see this plaque as they walk before they walk under the tracks in the walkway.
Let me give a little-known railroad fact, if I might. That fence right behind the historical marker is a reproduction of what might have been there at some point in time. But in my working railroad career, there was a chain link fence. And nobody could figure out why in that chain link fence, right at the spot where that marker is, was a Texas and Pacific Railway logo diamond shape that was cut out of that chain link fence. It was a perfect diamond. And no one could figure out why that was there. But I had the experience in my very earliest railroading career. That's how we got food from the Janacchio Hotel. It was passed through, that TNP diamond cut in that chain link fence was the perfect shape to pass plated food through.
Oh, wow.
To and from. And I want you to know, our dear mutual friend that I know we both admire and respect, Alan Loudermilk, the current owner and operator of the Janacchio,
yes,
wonderful restaurant and atmosphere. When they took that fence down, he cut that diamond out and saved it for the historical record.
Really?
So maybe someday that will go on display. And now here's a record of what it was really for.
I had never heard about that hole in the fence. That's interesting.
And I'm sure I'm sure some craftsman from the Marshall shops. I mean, it was a perfect diamond shape. So somebody did that they didn't just come up there and just cut a hole.
It wasn't a sloppy.
No, somebody did that on purpose.
Interesting. I did not know that.
But it was located right at the site of where that historical marker is now.
Interesting. Well, and another great thing that's happened only in the last year is that they now have a brick and mortar museum inside the depot. They have at least one room allocated to Boogie Woogie history.
And it is amazing. I have recently toured that, and I was blown away.
It's one of the only, there are references to Boogie Woogie in other museums like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but as far as a dedicated Boogie Woogie museum, it might be the first brick and mortar instance. It's small, but it's still a start, and it's actually dedicated to Boogie Woogie. And I think I know there's a lot more information in other rooms that they might be able to occupy in the depot in expansion of that.
You are right, sir. Yes, sir.
So that synergizes quite nicely. So I'm hoping that the guests of the Janaka will be compelled or interested in checking out the museum, not only the Boogie Woogie Museum, but there's another historic train museum in there as well.
An excellent one, yes.
Yeah. So let's see what we have. Yeah, so I mentioned this before, that as far as why I call Marshall the birthplace, it's because I use this specific definition, and it's a probabilistic statement, that the municipality whose boundaries are most likely to encompass or be closest to the point on the map, which is the geographic center of gravity of all instances of Boogie Woogie performance between 1870 and 1875.
That's just amazing, briefly repetitive from earlier in our visit here, that this can be traced as far back. The Civil War was just 5 years before. I mean, the Civil War was barely over when Boogie Woogie was born.
Yes, and I should also mention that in light of what you said, that my methodology is to basically is look at all claims. Boogie Woogie certainly has a lot of obscure aspects that we will never know for sure, but I tried to look at all claims that have been made about Boogie Woogie by researchers who came before me, and unless there's a contradiction, like if one person said it's X and another person said no, it's A or whatever, that's not consistent, then you have to say probabilistically which do you think is more likely to be true. But certainly the earliest instances I can find that attribute Boogie Woogie to a certain decade, say the early 1870s, as well as another line of research looked at people who were alive at around 1940, and the oldest people they could find in Texas said that they could remember Boogie Woogie being played for as long as they could remember, which certainly is consistent with it having been in the 80s.
Surely.
So that's
Surely.
It seems plausible, and really, it gets down to the question like, what's your definition of Boogie Woogie? What are the necessary and sufficient elements that a piano music, which it was regarded as, has to have to be Boogie Woogie? And we can talk about some of those, some of which was the ostinato, but there are other elements as well that made it Boogie Woogie and made it something different than the so-called ragtime music that might have come before it.
Okay.
It definitely did come before it, actually. So let me see if I'll come to that in a moment, but this is a kind of a visual representation of what I've kind of alluded to verbally, and that we know that rock and roll music and Boogie Woogie specifically came from the South, and based on the research done in the 1930s, the Boogie Woogie was attributed to Texas specifically, but it was cited as having various elements, not only in the early 1870s, but being originated by African Americans, associated with locomotives and the rail system, as well as lumbering camps that were kind of symbiotic with those locomotive developments, and then also the piney woods, which was the primary wood that was being lumbered. Of course, there were certainly deciduous trees in the area, so it wasn't strictly pines, but the emphasis has been placed predominantly on the pines. But these elements were present in the Marshall and Harrison County area to very high degrees. They had the very high and sometimes the highest African-American population in Texas. It certainly, the railroad was there in the early 1870s. It was the only deep piney woods railroad hub. Houston had a fairly developed railroad hub, but it generally was not regarded as being in the piney woods, even though there were certainly pines in North Harris County, but it's generally not regarded as the piney woods per se, although east of Houston was. But as far as the elements associated with Boogie Woogie, in Marshall had those in that general area of Harrison County, had those in a degree more than other places, and that also contributed to the probabilistic statement that Marshall was the most likely municipality to be at the center of that. But this is just a kind of a Venn diagram representation of that.
It makes sense.
Yeah, and I certainly, I've always asked people, like, can you think of a better municipality, a better candidate as a municipality other than Marshall? Maybe something I've overlooked, and no one's ever mentioned an alternative that seemed to be stronger representative or candidate than Marshall. So I think Marshall, at least in that sense, has stood the test of time. This is, and speaking of time, there were different eras. Boogie Woogie, as far as public awareness, really became popular, I think, especially in the late 1930s when it became conflated with swing dancing, and that's when really it was brought to wide audiences in particular, and much more broadcast and diffuse, and in some cases sterilized from its original more sensual meaning in the lumber camps and so forth. But what I did in this particular graph here, or chart, is break it down to a Marshall era and kind of talk about the diffusion of Boogie Woogie, because it does appear that likely that it originated in this area. If in the early 1870s, there were certainly prototypical things. There were musical sensibilities that would have been present even prior to that music being played on the piano. So rhythmic sensibilities to improvise, polyrhythm, having different rhythms interact, not necessarily played on a piano, but played on drums. And a lot of people, musicologists, have generalized in saying that Boogie Woogie is essentially drum music played on the piano, or that Boogie Woogie is treating the piano like it's 88 separate drums. It's much more tended to...
Oh, repeat that, please.
Yeah,
playing the piano as if...
As if it is a drum, yeah, or as if it's specifically 88 separate drums.
88... What a concept. Yeah, I've never heard that before.
Because it really is a percussive instrument. Each, in a real piano, at least, each, and this actually has hammers in it, but they're digital. It's not actually hitting a string, but a real piano is a percussive instrument. You're causing, you could say by remote control, a hammer to hit a string. So it's a percussive event, and it has the elements of a percussive event where it can get, if you hit that string or the membrane, whatever, really hard, you get a really bright sound. If you hit it soft, you get a softer sound. So. Or like if you get really like a tone cluster, very dissonant, but you have a dimension of expressiveness by how hard you're hitting it, because the timbre, the sound can change substantially from a soft played note to one really loud. It just gets much brighter. So that's tapping into that percussive aspect as opposed to tuning into, how well does it harmonize? It might not harmonize well at all, but it didn't matter because people were more attentive to the rhythm and the way those rhythms interact. The right hand and the left hand, the right hand interacted with each other.
I see.
But I'll come back to that in a moment. But this was just essentially an era. The public knows that they hear of Boogie Woogie in the 20s and 30s in Chicago, but in the 1911 or so, there were some notable things happening in Houston, and so you can kind of trace its diffusion throughout the United States and ultimately to the world based on these eras here.
Well, would it be safe to say that there would not be a diffusion era, meaning a Chicago era or any other, a Detroit, New York, or L.A. without the railroad? In yes. The railroad, how this music was diffused?
Absolutely, yes. So the itinerant musicians, their routes of travel, their routes of spreading their music was very much dictated by wherever the railroads happened to have built. Which, if the railroads had not built there, they would not have been taking horse and buggy or automobiles, which weren't around at that time. So yes, the railroads really did influence not just the diffusion of the music, but pretty much all human products. Products and including music.
I have to wonder. I wonder how many boogie woogie musicians perhaps wrote their own compositions while traveling on a train itself, just by listening.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, they traveled. There were two. You probably know this, but just like the hobos, they would either ride in the blinds between the cars, or if they were assuming the conductor wasn't letting them ride normally, which you might give them a better accommodation, but either in the blinds or on the rods below the car. So
correct,
which was more dangerous. So they're going to be exposed to those train sounds very intensely, the clickety clacks in particular in those locations. But yeah, I have no doubt, even if they weren't consciously riding, when they got off that train to the next lumber camp, those sounds are going to be very fresh in their mind, and that's just part of those incessant sounds which influenced the boogie woogie and which would be ever present, and you couldn't get away from it if you were traveling from one spot to another.
Surely.
Yeah. So they didn't have sound shielding like a modern automobile, so it was definitely loud, I'm sure. Let's see. Yeah, so that's enough about that slide. But this is a slide from a biologist. It was a government publication that showed where the regions were with different types of vegetation. So Area 17 was the the loblolly pines. Area 1 was the longleaf pines, but collectively both of those areas are the piney woods. And then Area 16 had some, I'm sure pines too, but had more deciduous trees. But Boogie Woogie historically was cited as coming from the piney woods. So that's the.
And isn't it funny that Area 17 certainly approximates the main line of the Texas and Pacific Railway, Texarkana, Marshall, Longview?
Well, absolutely. And not only that, the connection it made in Longview and then down by with the International Great Northern, it follows that too. So if you take that route from Houston, that was established in 1873, by the way,
correct,
that they connected up at Palestine. So from Houston to Palestine to Longview over to Marshall and then up to Texarkana, that's almost in the dead center of that Area 17 on that. So yeah, that does correlate quite nicely with the piney wood region there, with the loblolly pines in particular. Yeah, interestingly, the Area 1 and later after 1904, there were some really big turpentine camps in Area 1 and the longleaf pines, and those were also areas where Boogie Woogie came to be played, but there's no evidence that it was being played as early as the 1870s. So that's one reason I think it was less probable to have started in the turpentine camp areas of Area 1, because those camps really did not get underway until after 20th century in terms of large scale, labor camps.
All right.
So this is an interesting map. This is a map that the Texas General Land Office has in its possession. It's I want to say, it's an 1859 map, but it shows the route that was started to be built in 1858. That goes from Swanson's Landing on the Caddo Lake up in the upper right-hand corner.
Now, are we looking at the red line?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
The thin red line.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the original route of the railroad from Swanson's Landing on the south shore of Caddo Lake.
I know you are. Forgive me for interrupting, but from a historical context for our viewers. And I know Dr. Tennison is well informed of this, but this Southern Pacific Railroad has zero connection to the later Southern Pacific lines, which covered most of the western part of the United States.
Yes.
This is a predecessor name that was totally unconnected from the modern day, or what modern day in my lifetime, Southern Pacific lines.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So this Southern Pacific, I believe it got its charter in the 1850s, and ultimately got subsumed into the Texas and Pacific in early 1870s, and then of course after that there was a Southern Pacific building out from California.
Tell us what we're looking at here, please, Doctor.
Sure.
The top is Swanson's Landing.
Yes.
Was that in Texas or Louisiana?
It was just over the border, so it was just west of the Texas-Louisiana border, and it was by design that they started there. They needed to build 20 miles of track to satisfy their charter by a certain deadline, and so but it had to be in Texas because it was a Texas railroad. So the way to do that is they were bringing the rail materials up the river up to the Caddo Lake, and offloading there just after, because they couldn't get into Texas any quicker than that. But once they got into Texas, anything they built would give them credit towards that 20 miles, and they wanted to get to Marshall too.
Is that site archaeologically discoverable today?
It's known certainly where Swanson Landing was. Yeah.
Okay.
Now I don't know if are there any remnants. I know people have looked. I've been there myself with friends, and I haven't seen any old rails or ties or anything like that. It would be so old. But it's on private land right now. But you can approach Swanson's Landing from either the lake or from the land.
Okay.
And you can infer and determine on modern maps where that red line route would have been.
Okay, where is Marshall on this map?
So Marshall's on the far left side. If you see that little the square,
yes,
the little. I don't know if I can put the arrow on it here.
Yes.
I don't have access to the arrow, but that you can see the word Marshall, and it's laid out as almost as if it's a perfect grid. I don't think the Marshall was actually that perfect of a grid. Maybe it was at that time, but it ultimately didn't stay that way. But
okay, so right in the U, it kind of makes a U, a little bit of a U shape.
Yes.
Right in the apex of the U, where would that be today?
That's Jonesville. So modern day.
Okay.
Yeah, modern day Jonesville.
Okay.
And Jonesville still exists, but they actually moved their location based on where the route of the track was going to be. So the modern day location of Jonesville is not exactly where it used to be, from what I understand.
Well, Jonesville is on today's Union Pacific main line between Marshall and Shreveport. So
yes,
it still exists as a railroad site.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But I'm pretty sure that location of Jonesville was not the original location of where Jonesville was.
Got it.
But the other interesting thing that happened is The part of this track between Swanson's Landing and Jonesville, that was actually taken up by Magruder's men during the Civil War because they needed to relay that track to Shreveport for a supply line. So the section of this track between Swanson's Landing and Jonesville was removed and used to extend towards Shreveport to create a continuous line between Marshall and Shreveport during the Civil War to get supplies between the two. And you can see some maps that reflect that. But in 1858, the Civil War hadn't started, obviously.
Wait now, because I want to make historically, I want to make sure I understand. The track between Jonesville and Swanson's Landing was removed and placed where?
It was actually used to extend the track, to build the track between Jonesville and Shreveport. Yeah, I don't know that it covered. I don't think it covered all that distance, but it was part of the distance because they were trying to create a connection between Shreveport and Marshall, which they did.
Yeah, there was a Confederate ammunition dump at Marshall, I think.
That could have been a motivation
that the Confederates wanted to access. I think
that makes sense. Actually, yeah, because I know after the Civil War ended, they put that line between Marshall and Shreveport in service as early as 1860. I think it was July of 1866, where they started, opening up to normal passenger service.
On what route?
The route between Marshall and Shreveport. And at that point, it was the Southern Pacific Railroad still.
As early as 1866?
Oh, definitely.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
That's a fact I did not know.
Well, and it's there's even some old train schedules that were published for the Southern Pacific along that route.
I believe you've shown them to me because they show stagecoach connections to and from the train service.
I think so. Yeah. And there's even I have an article on the Boogie Woogie Foundation website, bowofo.org. I think the magazine was called Chatterbox, but I want to say it was a German traveler who actually took the train ride in 1866 or thereabouts. Maybe it might have been 1868. I think it was a little later, but it was when it was still Southern Pacific. And he talked. The train broke down, and there was just all these just hilarious things that were happening. They eventually got there, but he was not pleased with his experience. But it was still a very humorous experience and seemingly a real account of that, of taking the train from Marshall to Shreveport in the late 1860s.
Wow. Okay.
So yeah, but this is basically what, before that happened in the 1850s, they had to satisfy their charter. So they actually did have let me take it forward here. That's actually a detail. That's moving a little closer to showing where Swanson's Landing was. And you can see the mile markers from Swanson's Landing. But the question, I'll come to the train itself as satisfying the charter, but the reason it was started at Swanson's Landing is, as I said a moment ago, they had to get credit in the state of Texas. So Swanson's Landing was pretty much the earliest place they could start after crossing over the Texas border to start laying that track. So that's why they did that, because it got them the credit. And then once they got down to that latitude parallel with Marshall, they really didn't. And especially once they built the train back to Shreveport, they didn't need to bring rail up to Swanson's Landing anymore because they could just bring it along the rails from Shreveport.
And Swanson's Landing is a landing on Caddo Lake.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah,
the only natural lake in the state of Texas.
I have heard that. Yeah,
it is created by the New Madrid earthquake of 1840s, maybe.
Interesting. Well, and I also heard that the Red River raft had influenced the water levels at the Caddo Lake.
Oh, it certainly did
in some way. So that was
Captain Shreve, I think, is who broke the log jam and
influenced the levels and made some things, I think, less navigable upstream than they might have been. But yeah, so part of the I guess the magnitude of that lake was probably created by having some of the raft intact, and so there was a happy medium there. If there was too much raft, then you couldn't navigate at all. But if there was too little raft, then the water wouldn't stay, and you couldn't navigate that way either. So there's kind of this inverted U function.
Right.
Where,
okay.
But this is what I wanted to come to. I call it Train Day, but it was on February 11th, 1858, that they satisfied their charter using a 440 locomotive similar to the one on this cover of John White Jr.'s book, which contained various engravings of locomotives. So that's actually very similar to that picture on the cover to the kind of locomotive that they used. But this locomotive, the very first one they used to satisfy the charter, was also brought up by steamboat to Swanson's Landing. So I think they might have had even more than one there at the time, but they obviously had to have a train that worked. And that was 1858 that happened. And at that point, the 20 miles, when they said they went to Marshall, the station itself they went to was actually east of the current place where the Marshall Depot exists now, the TMB Depot. It was actually, I think it was maybe like a mile east of the Marshall city limits, but they still call it the Marshall Depot. Even so, it was regarded as having gone to Marshall. But
while you have this slide up, my guess is that you're showing us a representation of a steam locomotive that first produced the sounds and rhythms that catalyzed boogie woogie music.
Yes, yeah, exactly. This would have been a sound that people would have started to become accustomed to in as early as 1858, after it was brought upstream. And so I think there probably was a sleeper effect in the sense that even before people had an opportunity to play the piano, that sound was still becoming more common and more incessant as more locomotives were being brought to the area.
Okay.
Yeah. And the other thing I've discovered, and I know you know about the current train, the 316 run by the Texas State Railroad.
I do.
It was a 460, so-called 10-wheeler, but there is a sound when you have one of those smaller locomotives like that, or even a smaller like a 440, working hard and just really working hard. It creates a sound. It's like making a guitar amp distort. It's like making that piece of machinery work as hard as it can, and you get a dramatic sound that you just don't get if you have like a big boy that's barely having to work as hard for the same grade. You just don't get the sound quality. And so I think there is something about the early sound, and maybe even more so with the 460s when they're working hard, that just sounds very much like boogie woogie and just very organic and alive.
I agree. I'm in my 15th year as a board member of the Texas State Railroad Authority, and I want you, number one, thank you for relaying that story, and because, ladies and gentlemen, for viewer interest, if you want to experience the rhythm and sounds and harmony of a steam locomotive, I invite you to ride the Texas State Railroad. Easy to find and easy to reserve and easy to get to. So
absolutely, and not just the sound, the chuffs, but the steam whistle and the reverberation of the forest. It's just it's a glorious experience. I was lucky because I got to ride in the cab when they first brought the 316 back, and Earl Noob was the engineer, and it was a wonderful experience, and I would love to do that again.
Earl Noob was actually our general manager. So you had the general manager running the train that day. Interesting.
Well, yeah, it was a lot of fun, and that firebox. I remember that you got to have respect for that firebox because it is hot, and
it is.
And if you have recording equipment, you don't want it too close to the fire. So
you know what the old story is about a steam locomotive firebox. It's a great thing to have in the wintertime.
Yeah, and this was probably, I think it wasn't too cold. So yeah, I could definitely feel the heat. And they had me standing back kind of between the tender and the engine. I was in a even more distant, but the fireman, I'm sure he had it worse than I did. So, but lots of fun for that at that time. And this is that same corridor from Jonesville up to Marshall. I call it Birthplace Way because these 12 miles are still, they were not taken up during the Civil War. So this is the exact same railroad corridor through Scottville and through Jonesville onto Shreveport that was there at the end of the Civil War and then continued as passenger service in the late 1860s. So
you are really providing some for me some cutting edge history here. So there was rail passenger service in East Texas as early as 1865.
The Civil War, during the Civil War, it was being used for military purposes. And if memory serves, it was July of 1866 when they opened it up for passenger service.
Wow.
I think I'm almost certain it was 1866.
And the red line you're showing us right now is where you have determined by excellent historical research, and I'm sure very time-consuming, that's the probable birthplace of Boogie Woogie. Is that what that means?
Not necessarily the line itself, but the reason I say birthplace way is because this was the route that the railroad took to get to Marshall, which I call the birthplace of Boogie Woogie. So this was kind of the way to the birthplace.
Okay.
That's the way I consider it.
Okay, so the route to the birthplace did not come from Texarkana to the north or Longview to the west. It came from Shreveport to the east.
Yeah, well, it came from Swanson's Landing. It basically the de novo. It was basically a railroad hub was invented de novo in Northeast Texas by bringing the rails there and starting from scratch, as opposed to extending them from another location.
I got it.
Which was usually the case.
Okay.
I think there's some instances on like St. Louis where they brought a train and got to start at a track from the Mississippi going inland like
Correct.
that. But this was more deep in a forest. It happened in some lumbering operations, but as far as in terms of what became a mainline railroad, this was kind of special because it was a very isolated hub that had its start, by taking those rails up the bayous into the Caddo Lake and starting it that way. And then ultimately, once it was connected with Shreveport during the Civil War, then it became much easier just to bring supplies from Shreveport. But they still had to bring it up the Red River to get it to Shreveport because there was no bridge until like 1881, I think, over the Red River.
By your verification, I think Birthplace Way represents today's Union Pacific Main Line, that portion of it. I think the railroad is very much still there.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's part of what I was trying to convey. This is still intact. This exact corridor is, with I don't know of any changes that have occurred, is the same corridor that was present in 1858.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
So that's why I emphasize that. And of course there was some of it that got extended east of Jonesville, but it was really this section from Jonesville to Marshall that was the track that was there in 1858 when they first satisfied that charter.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's see. So another thing I emphasize is the year 1873. I had mentioned that corridor from Texarkana to Marshall to Longview down to Houston was established. So it really was the first north-south corridor through the piney woods of East Texas. You had the Houston East and West Texas Railroad, which went from Houston to Shreveport, but that was not that was later, and that wasn't strictly Texas. But this was important because in referencing Longview was essentially the point. It became kind of this border town, if you will, between what was the Texan Pacific and then when you jumped off to the International and Great Northern Railroad. Right. So you were changing railroads. It was like going to a different country, so to speak. So Longview was important. It was a junction town, and that happened on July 1st, 1873, when the rail line opened between Longview, Texas, and actually that's between Longview, Texas, and Dallas. So that happened pretty readily as well. But in terms of the piney woods, it was that Longview line down to Palestine. They were building northward from Houston to Palestine. And also the International Great Northern was building southward from Longview, and the tracks met in Palestine. So, and that established that corridor in 1873. So the other thing worth pointing out, which I mentioned a while ago, is that even though they had a track all the way to Shreveport, there was no bridge over the Red River yet. So it was a dead end. They couldn't continue by rail. They had to get on the steamboat or to get down to New Orleans or other points, or ferry over the river. But there was no bridge there. So, whereas in Texarkana by 1874, the Cairo and Fulton had gotten over the Red River, so
right,
we could take things out of Texas through Texarkana onto points, New York, Chicago, well before we could do that continuously by rail. Well before Shreveport was able to do it.
Let me, Doctor, if I might, let me digress for just one moment and ask a question about the Southern Pacific. Hallsville, Texas became the corporate headquarters for the Southern Pacific Railroad.
Yes.
And Hallsville today is arguably almost a suburb of Longview. Mm-hmm. But at that time, it was just an expanse between the two. But the point of my question is, in your research, have you had any history of boogie woogie music in Hallsville or the Hallsville area?
That's a great question. I have looked for evidence of that, and I haven't found any. However, I would not be surprised. Just like the city of Longview reportedly had a boogie woogie bass figure named after it, I would not be surprised if there was something that had a center of gravity in Hallsville. But I haven't been able to confirm that specific.
Okay, I just wondered. In fact, I've often wondered all of my railroad career exactly where the corporate offices of the Southern Pacific Railroad were located. I'll bet somebody knows somewhere.
Well, I've looked. If you find out, let me know. I'm sure.
To any of our viewers, if you do know, please answer that question in the comments section. If anybody knows where the Southern Pacific corporate offices were located, but we're talking about now 154 years ago. So that's a long time to try to figure out where something was located.
That's true. And I know there were some saloons. There certainly, it's almost almost certain that there was music being played in Hallsville, and probably boogie woogie music, at least by the early 1870s. But at that point in time, because the Southern Pacific got absorbed into the Texas Pacific, it might not have been, it might not. It's possible that what was being played in Hallsville during the era of the Southern Pacific might not have been boogie woogie per se.
And that occurred, the absorption of the Southern Pacific by the Texas and Pacific Railway occurred in 1871?
I think it was, because the Texas and Pacific was formed in 1871, so I think the absorption occurred short. It might have been 1872, but by 1873, I think it had fully occurred, I'm pretty sure. I have to go back and check, but I think that's correct. But Hallsville, I've been to Hallsville, and I've walked around in deep grass, probably should not have done that, but I couldn't find any old structures. But there's new technology like LiDAR and other things that can detect things that are not visible to the eye, which I won't be surprised if we learned something of old foundations.
The Southern Pacific shops were located in Hallsville too.
Yes. And there are some annual reports that mentioned the cars they had and the different materials they had in Hallsville. And they were building, I don't think they were building locomotives, but they were building some actual cars and rolling stock in Hallsville. So wood frame type of things.
Okay.
So
all right.
Yeah, and I'd have to go back and look at those sources. But yeah, there's some fascinating things about there was another story about a steam locomotive supposedly being brought all the way up to the essentially what's Moore's Landing, where the railroad track now crosses Cass County into Bowie County, and this was. No one knows what happened to this locomotive. It was a locomotive that might have just rusted out or gotten disassembled or scrapped, but it never had track to run on. It was supposedly unloaded on the dock, but then they didn't get the track there in time, and I've never been able to learn what happened to it.
Wow.
Assuming that the story's true, which probably is. And there was also some French locomotives that were manufactured that never made it to the area as well, which I don't have all the information ready, but that'd be another story for a podcast. There were rather large locomotives for the time.
Built in France.
And they were French made, yeah.
And built for the Texas and Pacific Railway?
They were built either for the Texas and Pacific or for it might have been one of the predecessor railroads like the Southern Pacific or the Transcontinental Railroad, or maybe the Memphis, El Paso and Pacific. But it was it was either precursor railroad or the Texas and Pacific Railroad.
Well, even though this is not the topic of our podcast, you can't leave us hanging. What happened to them? Did they sink in the river? Or?
I'm trying to figure out. There was an issue in one of the railroad journals that talks about, even has a photo of one of them. But I heard at one point that some of them might have made it to New Orleans. In fact, I know it wasn't the Texas and Pacific because it was the Civil War that supposedly detained them or that prevented them arriving there.
Then it would have been Southern Pacific.
It would have been Southern Pacific. And supposedly one or more of them made it to New Orleans but didn't make it past New Orleans.
Okay.
But there is a photo of one of the photo of one of them that's in one of the railroad journals that I'll have to hunt that up because that's a fascinating story in itself. Things that just these mysteries of that. The fog of war and things that happened that got obscured in time.
Well, one of the purposes of this podcast is to uncover a few railroad secrets. So
absolutely, yeah. That photo would be wonderful. I have the journal that has a copy of that. So
okay, all right, sir.
So the milestone year 1873 in terms of the track development, and in particular the development between Marshall and Texarkana had some very interesting milestones. But I'm going to go there in a minute. But this shows the development of the railroads by decade. This is in 1870.
Oh, I think this slide is so dramatic because, ladies and gentlemen, you're looking at all of railroad activity in Texas in the year 1870.
Yes, this is as authoritative as I can find. And you'll notice that if you look at, there's a mark up there. You can see two lines up near Marshall. There's one that goes from Marshall, about Marshall to the border, and there's that other little line. And that's a little bit confusing, but that might have been some remnant track that existed. You can clearly see it does not curve around and go to Swanson's Landing.
Right.
But that little black line that's diagonal all by itself, I'm not sure what that represents. That might have been something residual part that was intended to kind of show what had gone up to Swanson's Landing, but the fact that it's kind of running from southeast and northwest is inconsistent with that 1858 map. So that might be a slight inaccuracy in this, but I think they were trying to show that there was a disjointedness where some of the track had gotten taken up and rerouted, is I think what they're trying to show there. But you can see the Houston corridor, the Houston hub, is much better developed, but it's not a de novo thing. It probably, I think it did start down the Galveston area and build up to Houston and then continue to expand from there.
Got it.
But it's definitely not considered to be in the piney woods.
Okay.
So, and then the other little stretch there, but
fascinating.
Yeah, and it develops, of course, continuously. But if you jump a decade, 1880s, you can see like from 1870 to 1880, a lot more track has been built.
Well, now that says by 1870. Oh, I see. By 1873, the first north-south route through the piney woods.
Yeah. Okay. So this is an 1880 map, but
okay,
that portion shows the red town names. That was actually present by 1873.
Got it.
Yeah, and that was of course the route that goes from south or north to south, Texarkana down through to Marshall, then over westward to Longview, then down Palestine and down to Houston.
So we had connected Houston, Longview, and Texarkana by 1873.
Yes,
okay.
exactly.
Okay.
Yes, and so this shows that, and this is, if I specifically look at 1873 on the part of this map that between Texarkana and Marshall. These are some more specific milestones. From June all the way through of 1873 through February of 1874. These are things that were published in the newspapers, and these were actually well researched by Jacques Boogie, who wrote a history of steamboat navigation on the Cypress Bayou. But he had a lot of railroad history. Did a really fine job. So he just mentioned some of the milestones, but
this is important and obscure railroad history. So thank you for doing that research. I have never, ever seen this close-up view of when sections were complete, portions of the fledgling Texas and Pacific Railway were created. This is an important historical slide.
For those of us who love the T&P especially, it's just so nice to have this. And Jacques Boogie is a consummate scholar. These are taken from railroad articles, which we're publishing, that saying the railroad has now reached this or they've now finished this construction. So I think it's, sometimes they're not perfectly accurate, but I think it's pretty darn accurate. So milestones on this that you see October 2nd, rails reached Moore's Landing. So that's basically the southern part of Bowie County that's on the northern shore of the Sulphur River. So that's basically saying that
where is Moore's? Does Moore's Landing exist today?
Well, it's not by a namesake. There's no sign that says Moore's Landing, but it essentially was where the TP tracks crosses from Cass County into Bowie County.
Okay.
That Bowie County shore, that south shore of Bowie County, that's Moore's Landing.
All right.
That's where Moore's Landing was.
All right.
And that's not the same thing as Mooresville. Mooresville, the community, was closer to like kind of between Texarkana and Redwater. But Moore's Landing was on the Sulphur River.
So Moore's Landing would be in between today's Atlanta, Texas, and Texarkana.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And the community, the Buchanan community, was a little north of Moore's Landing.
Okay.
Yes, a little further into Bowie County. But based on what Jacques Boogie had found, if the rails are reaching Moore's Landing, that implies that they had completed the bridge itself over the Sulphur River. So they said, rails reach Moore's Landing on October 2nd, cars running between Jefferson and Moore's Landing by November 19th, and then the rail line to Texarkana was in service by December 28th.
Isn't that the date Texarkana considers its birthday?
Well, actually, Texarkana calls it. It depends on who you talk to.
Okay.
Texarkana sold its first city lots on December 8th of 1873, but on that date, there was no. They might have had a track completed to the area of the border near downtown Texarkana, but they didn't have passenger service because it's definitely been reported that the people who came to buy lots on December 8th of 1873 had to take the train north to Nash. The area, it was then known as Curve City because that's where the curve was made.
Correct.
Transcontinental Junction.
Correct.
But that they couldn't go further than that. They had to take a stagecoach for that last 5 miles to get to the border in what is now downtown Texarkana, which is where the rails were sold. But there are some reports of a train arriving in Texarkana in earlier December of 1873. But based on this report, the only way really to reconcile that is to say maybe that was a test run with the executives or engineers, but not part of the regular passenger service, which appears to have started on December 28th.
Got it.
But by then they weren't. It's still the bridge over the Red River had not been completed, so they were running cars to Texarkana by late 1873, but not until February of 74 did the bridge get completed, and which allowed travel to St. Louis and the East Coast, pretty much.
I have to ask this obscure question. How in heaven's name does one come across a book entitled A History of Navigation on Cypress Bayou and the Lakes by Jacques de Bouguer, and then go so far as to discover that pages 575 through 585 give a history of the Texas and Pacific Railway between Marshall and Texarkana? How does one do that?
Well, I'll tell you, I've been the beneficiary of friends with knowledge and who come to me and say, hey, John, I think this might be relevant to your interest. So in this particular instance, it was Jack Canson of Marshall, Texas, who has been a great friend of mine, also has done some boogie woogie research himself. He's also responsible for writing the highly distilled narrative that appears on the boogie woogie plaque in Marshall.
Okay.
But I don't know how Jack Canson learned about Jacques Bouguer, but he knew that Swanson Landing was important to the history of boogie woogie, and he had learned of this book. And he actually mentioned, I've talked with Jacques Bouguer over the phone, but he said, this guy Jacques Bouguer, he's such a great scholar, and he is. But he had a microfilm reader in his home. It wasn't just like go to the library. He had it in his house, and he would be studying the old microfilms in his home.
So this is a fairly recent, well, at least a 20th century book.
Oh, for sure, yes. Okay, absolutely, yeah. And but yeah, it is. The title does not suggest that you would have such a detailed railroad history, because he was really talking about the steamboat traffic on the Cypress Bayou. But that there was competition between the railroads and the steamboat industry, and at one point it looked like that Jefferson they were gonna go all the way to Jefferson, start building the tracks there.
Correct.
And Jefferson lost out because they decided to use Swanson's Landing instead. But at that point, Jefferson was still a prominent steamboat destination.
Surely.
So that it didn't destroy that industry yet. Ultimately, it did, but it not at that point. That and maybe the raft, the Red River raft, being destroyed to the point of making navigation difficult at certain times and places. But but it's a great book. Jacques Bouguer has also written a book on the history of Jefferson itself, which is quite good.
Okay.
But it's Jack Canson for that particular title. I have to thank.
All right. Thank you for updating us.
Oh, you're welcome. So that's some of those highlights there. And so how did it first occur? This I kind of hinted at how did Boogie Woogie first occur, is that there were pre-existing African musical sensibilities, such as the drumming, the percussion, the polyrhythmic, the ostinato, repeating rhythms that were already being played out on drums when drums were allowed. They weren't always allowed. Sometimes they were illegal, and you had to play them in a stealth manner, I'm sure. But those sensibilities were there, and when the train sounds came along, that conflated and intermingled with those sensibilities and became expressed in on the pianos, which they played as if or like they were drums. So that's one aspect of it. But here are some of those elements. So ostinato, and of course, ostinato is any repeating figure. It could be, my keyboard turned itself off there because I stayed on it too long without playing it. So I'll let that boot up. So basically, ostinato is anything that repeats. But the most important thing, which is usually the left hand, is that it's always moving. So that's always moving, or you can always... That's always moving. You can create any kind of constant movement that doesn't have to be a repeating figure as long as it moves ever. But the other thing is polyrhythm. This is another thing that's quite interesting and maybe hyperbolized in Boogie Woogie. Polyrhythm is essentially, I think, best understood as a rhythm that results from combining the right hand rhythm and the left hand rhythm, but which does not exist independently in the right hand or left hand. So a very simple example of that would be like a swing pulse. If I'm playing a single note here, like that, that's a very bland rhythm if you call it a rhythm at all. It's just a constant pulse. Same thing here. If I do the same thing here, it's the same rhythm but just lower. Now if I shift the frame between them so that they're not playing in sync like this, but rather one slightly shifted, I can get bump a bump a 1 the 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3. It's almost like a fast waltz, but it's also a shuffle rhythm. It's a swing rhythm, bump 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 bump, as opposed to a straight bump 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 bump. So that's one thing, that the polyrhythmic aspect, the rhythm of that swing, the dum the dum the dum, results from the interaction of the hands, but is not present in either hand alone. But there are also other aspects of polyrhythm that are used in Africa a lot. And
I'm always asking now, because you're giving us the ingredients of Boogie Woogie.
Yes, these are, you can call them musical sensibilities or stylistic or performance tendencies that were already present prior to playing them on piano. They were already being played on drums and other melodic, sometimes in the melody lines of ragtime music, not so much in the left hand, but once those were adopted to the piano, those did become some of the fundamental elements of boogie woogie. But they were basically, as I say, African musical sensibilities or stylistic tendencies that were already present, but ultimately applied to the piano, which is really kind of the threshold of what became boogie woogie. When you played the piano like you used to be playing a drum, that essentially is what, hey, that's new. I haven't heard that before. That's boogie woogie. You know, they might not have called it that originally, but that's essentially what came to be called. Boogie woogie. But there are other aspects of polyrhythm. I was going to say like a 3-on-2 where you play one like one hand, one tempo. So 2 beats here for 3 here, like that. And so that's an element you hear in boogie woogie. And then you also hear things like different tempos at the same time. So let's see. Something like that. So different rhythms, different tempos in either hand, another way to do it. And then improvisation. So basically, rather than being a composed music, boogie woogie, when improvised, is really one of the earliest forms of jazz. Some might argue that it was even earlier, that it qualified as a definition of, or an instance of jazz even before New Orleans was known for jazz. So this was the early 1870s, and if you're sitting down at a piano and you're making stuff up on the spot, thus improvisation, that's an element of jazz.
Well, may I just make a generalized observation that unlike the diesel locomotive, steam locomotives probably had distinct and separate sounds unique to each locomotive.
I bet, yeah, there was less consistency in manufacturing, right?
Yes, and in size of driving wheels and fireboxes. So I would think the improvisation would have naturally occurred from train sounds to the keyboard.
Yeah, certainly I think that correlated, and that could have influenced that because, there were a lot more unpredictabilities in the steam locomotive environment, for sure. And as far as the improvisation goes, there's lots of ways to improvise, but these days boogie. The earliest, like the jazz label Blue Note, which was one of the early jazz labels, the earliest recordings that were made on that were by Boogie Woogie, me, Lex Lewis, and Albert Ammons. They were Boogie Woogie players, and in modern times, sometimes Boogie Woogie gets left out of a definition of jazz. But anyone I've ever talked to, serious musicians, always say that if you play Boogie Woogie improvisatorily as opposed to like a discrete composition, that yes, it's absolutely jazz. So that's something. I think the word jazz is more respectable than the word boogie woogie, so it's good to see it included in jazz definitions because it really deserves to be included.
Am I correct in understanding that pianos were put into logging camps and lumber camps and maybe a few railroad shanties out in the middle of nowhere by the owners of such for the purpose of keeping their employees close to the job site to give them an outlet of something else to do?
Yes, that account is something that I've heard time and time again, is that the motivation was to actually have an instrument, an unwieldy instrument like an upright piano that couldn't be carted off like a guitar.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
It basically would basically be hopefully a curiosity and be of interest. And these were not like fine pianos. These were old dilapidated things in humid environments and not well protected. Probably with probably that very much out of tune and some keys maybe that didn't work. But they were brought in as an anchor or something to try to interest the workers into not wandering too far from camp so that they would be available for the next work cycle.
It must have worked.
I think it contributed to that. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure the women and the booze and everything didn't hurt, but that was the keyboards and the music were part of that sensual and sinful experience, if you will.
Got it.
So yeah, but absolutely. That's certainly that's a common belief, is that it was the bosses who brought it. It wasn't the workers that said, "Hey, I'm going to bring my piano with me to work." But once they were there, then there was awareness of it there, and that created an anchor or a venue for the traveling musicians where they with some degree of predictability, they could go to a lumber camp and the piano would already be there because they were definitely not bringing it with them.
Got it.
That's for sure.
Got it.
So improvisation I think I've said what I would want to say about that. And then, of course, swing. That's it. That whole race to the bump, ba bump, ba bump, ba bump. But what they did in Boogie Woogie was improvise the swing ratio. So you can play straight, you can play swing. So straight would be like, or I can play swing. Or I can vary between the ratios. I can play a little straight, like goes from straight to swing. So you're playing around with that swing ratio, and you didn't really see that in music prior to Boogie Woogie. Boogie Woogie, because it improvised everything, and sometimes to good effect, sometimes to bad effect, but it was the lack of discipline, the lack of training that allowed for improvisation even more, because there were no rules. They were largely untrained musicians, other than the pre-existing kind of sensibilities and percussion. There was no formal training on the keyboard. So that's those things meshed together and created a lot of new things that had never been heard before.
Surely.
On the piano. So let's see. So this is the other generalization. I said is playing the piano like a drum, or another way of putting it is Boogie Woogie is playing the piano as if it were 88 separate drums. And you have 10,
I just think that's a remarkable concept.
It really is, and it's literally true. I mean, it really is 88 separate drums. You have 88 separate mallets. You could say these are mallets, or you could say the hammers are mallets, and you have 88 or 10 remote controls, or you even have more if you do that. Yeah, and that's another tone clusters. That's another common thing in Boogie where you just play a lot of dissonant notes close together. Those are identified with starting with a man named Blind Tom Wiggins, who was another African American who imitated trained sounds with his mouth and also on the keyboard, but whose known imitation did not seemingly rise to the level of meeting all four of those elements of Boogie Woogie that I'd mentioned before. But he probably influenced Boogie Woogie players as well. He traveled through Marshall and Texarkana and maybe Longview as well eventually. But I mention him only because he's regarded as having originated tone clusters, i.e. the close non-harmonic dissonant use of notes like. As long as if you can create very interesting chuff sounds of like, if you play on the low register, you can get something that sounds, I think, even more like steam locomotive sounds. If you kind of like, if I imagine a relatively reverberant environment. Let's see here. I don't know if I can actually get this to. Hold on. That might be a little bit more reverberant. I don't know if I got the max of reverb, but if you put. Imagine like that chuff, that a tone cluster sounds more like a chuff than like if I'm going, or starts to really sound like chuffs down there.
Indeed it does.
And more so than the more harmonious, which is nice, but it's just not the same. So I think there was a lot of, imagine untrained musicians, they're not going to start like, oh yes, I'm going to play the broken octave bass. They're going, oh, what's that? Or oh wow, it's much more intuitive that
sure.
They would not necessarily do tone clusters with a mindfulness. Oh, I'm going to use that as my classical musical device to create chuffs, but that's going to be just done as a result of the lack of training, really.
Surely.
On the piano. But yeah, I enjoy that very much, playing tone clusters. It's a way to get out some frustration, and especially when you've been through stressful events, it's a good thing to play some tone clusters.
Got it.
So anyway, but yes, tone clusters, Blind Tom Wiggins, another great character. There was once an instance where Mark Twain did not know him, and actually he was riding a train where Blind Tom Wiggins was in the train, and he was sitting in the seat, I think, in front of Mark Twain, and just rocking back and forth, making train sounds. just all these train sounds. And Mark Twain, he said, who is this lunatic? Who is this guy? And he later learned and had great respect for him. But he writes this vivid description of essentially beatboxing of Blind Tom Wiggins. I want to say in the 1860s, maybe 1866 thereabouts. I'm not sure, but it's this very vivid description by Mark Twain of what would definitely be considered early beatboxing by Blind Tom Wiggins, but imitating train sounds.
And Blind Tom Wiggins was later to be known to inhabit the environs of Northeast Texas.
Well, he traveled. He traveled extensively. So he was born prior to the Civil War occurring, and even after he gained his freedom, his manager, I think, was somewhat exploitive, if not greatly exploitive of him. But he stayed with, I don't know if it had been the slave owner or the owner of Blind Tom Wiggins or not, but I can't remember that detail. But he basically stayed with this person who was basically his manager and toured around extensively in the United States, and I supposedly was a very high earning, one of the highest earning acts in the 19th century. And but he was known for great virtuosity on the keyboard, and as well as his steam locomotive imitations, which even if they didn't rise to the level of boogie woogie, probably still popularized the idea of imitating train sounds, or helped to popularize that of imitating trains on the keyboard. Although there were other pieces that were meant to represent train sounds on a piano keyboard that were not boogie woogie, but still were trying to represent the train, but in much less interesting ways that were written in the 1840s as sheet music.
Can you give us an example of each item you're talking about here on the keyboard?
I can talk a little bit. So basically, right. So as far as how that translates to the keyboard, the smokestack chuffing is almost always identified with something in the bass figure. So kind of what I was doing just in that tone cluster would be the best example would be. You can still hear some it's not completely dissonant, so it's not completely like a burst of white noise or noise in the physical sense of the word, but you get a lot of reverb. The right hand part of my ring's hitting the key right now, but that idea of the chuffing in the lower hand, steam whistles usually are like something like that. On the right, a little trills. Often used. That's also used for crossing of bridges, like in Lex Lewis's Honky Tonk Train Blues. It'll be sort of kind of a rolling chord like that, and that's also been used for what originally was the cows. Called the cows was also the idea of a cow being swept off the track by the cow catcher. Mm-hmm. They were using a rolling motif like that. But later, the term cows came to be conflated with that walking bass figure that was called the cows later, but originally, according to Lee Reed Sullivan, at least it was this something like that. So it was that makes more sense that that would be the sound of something being swept off the track.
Fascinating.
And the clickety clack, going over the seams and tracks, that can be represented in different ways. I mean, you could do that right-handed or left-handed. So I don't think there's one right way to do that, but collisions. Scott Joplin wrote a thing called the Great Crush Collision March, where they actually it's based on a real event where they staged
where people were killed in that event.
Yeah. I don't. Do you recall how many people died from that?
I don't, but W.G. Crush, I believe, was the man's actual name, and he was a passenger traffic manager, and he decided to stage this great railroad head-on collision for publicity purposes, and it all backfired.
Yeah, it was a big tragedy, and I haven't yet been to that site. I know that the historical marker where it originally occurred, they've actually moved it. It's no longer at the geographically correct location, but the locals in West Texas supposedly can tell you where to go to find the correct location.
It's west. That's right. That was yes.
Yeah, it was near current day West Texas. Yeah, but yeah, it was. They actually retitled it. It wasn't a municipality, but they called it the Collision at Crush. They named it after that guy.
Right.
But it was. I think it was a little bit south, if I'm not mistaken, where it's at now. But it's at a slightly different location, I am told. But in Scott Joplin's piece that he wrote based on that collision, it was essentially a dissonant chord. And it was. I don't think it was as much dissonant as like a tone cluster, but it was like something very dissonant in the piece, and that's a piece of published sheet music. But yeah, those are some examples, and basically just objects, passing objects, and so forth. But whistles, and of course, in modern day. Oh, I just turned off my computer, or hit a. No, I'm good. I think I temporarily disconnected the HDMI cable. Are we back? I'm gonna have to Pardon me. I think I hit the HDMI cable. There, we got it. It's good. Okay. Apologize for that. It's I tripped over the cable there.
We'll edit that out.
All right. So I kind of started a new thought. Let me get back on track here. What was
Can you give us an example of number 8, the overall composite polyrhythmic sound of train yards?
Yeah, I will do my best. So that would basically me playing as polyrhythmically as I can. So,
all right.
So let me see what I can do.
That'll be a lot closer than myself, or I'm sure a lot of our viewers can get.
This position. Yeah. So I'll maybe do a. Let me see if I can do the same thing with the. I might involve the hi-hat or might not, but I'll try to combine several of those elements and some different boogie woogie motifs here. And okay.
Well, I have been in 2 or 3 or more train yards in my railroad career, and I think you hit the nail right on the head.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It's a lot of fun. It can be exhausting, so you have to kind of
Sure.
take a break with the more calm stuff, interspersed with the more energetic stuff.
Sure.
But,
Remarkable. Thank you. Okay. All right. We're ready to move on.
okay, so yeah, that's it's always better, by the way, if I had a live drummer with a full drum set, then I can focus even more attention on just the keyboard.
Oh, surely.
And the polyrhythmic, the creativity, the spontaneity with a great drummer is wonderful. So I do and that's the beautiful thing is it's I don't have to worry about harmonic clashes because it's a non-pitched instrument. So we can all both focus on rhythm. So that's a 4/4/0 wheel configuration. That was the earliest wheel configuration when the trains first got started in 1858.
Surely.
I just had it on there for that reason. But I did that because the 2-cylinder American locomotives would have 4 beats or 4 chuffs for each turn of the big driving wheel. So you get like that. And that 4 or multiples of 4 did inform the rhythmic divisions of Boogie Woogie, which in the 30s and 40s came to be called 8 to the bar. But really, early on, it was probably 4 to the bar, but you can take a 4 to the bar beat like, and you can make it still 4 to the bar, but doubling it up on the octaves. So like 1, 2, 3, 4. But you can also think of that as 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that's why the 40s Boogie Woogie was called 8 to the bar. But there's definitely this correlation with the steam locomotive figures, as opposed to like ragtime, which was like pa, this kind of duple bass, which was pervasive in the 19th century prior to Boogie Woogie. So
surely
something really had to come along other than just a oompa or duple bass to be a different kind of bass figure in the 4 and 8. And even it doesn't have to be 4/8 to be Boogie Woogie. You can do an odd time signature like 7/8 times, like so like. So that's 7/8 times. It can be in any time signature as long as it has that sense of constant movement. It satisfies that sense of constant motion of Boogie Woogie, and I think is a kind of Boogie Woogie. So let's talk about a little bit of Boogie Woogie based figures, because this actually does have regional significance, but it also harkens back to what scholars had already learned in the 1930s, and that is that the Boogie Woogie players were very individualistic, very idiosyncratic, but they identified their particular styles of playing with specific towns or regions where these individual players had come from. And something like very similar to that was evident when I started interviewing people, including especially Lee Reese Sullivan in 1985, who mentioned 12 bass figures that he had learned from artists in the Boogie Woogie players in the 1940s, which were named after various sites in the Marshall, Texarkana, Shreveport area.
Okay, so wow, so actual Boogie Woogie keyboard sounds denote a geographical location.
Well, it's particular melodic sequences. Yeah, in this case, how these differ from each other, these are all ostinato or repeating bass figures, but they had different melodic sequences and rhythms, melody, rhythm and pitch being the aspect of melody, and that's what distinguished them. There were sounds. They were all piano sounds, but they were different from each other in terms of rhythm and the actual frequencies.
Another way to ask the question: so if you were Lee Reese Sullivan, and you were just closing your eyes, sitting listening to Boogie Woogie, you could tell what geographical location it had originated.
Well, yes, if that particular element was known to be associated with that area. So in Lee Reese's teaching and the people he learned from, this particular sequence, that particular sequence was associated with Marshall. That was called the Marshall bass figure.
Yeah, could you just go down the list here and
sure.
That was Marshall.
Yeah, and I actually have a music notation depiction of each of those. So if we go to the next slide, this is the Marshall figure. It's
great.
It's a 4-beat figure, and it's the thing that defines it in each of these as the respective name figures is not how many measures you play or whether it's 12 bars or not, but just that little motif. So that's the motif that defines it as Marshall. So you can play that as something on top of it. Whatever. So the other one, the next one, the Jefferson bass figure, it's also a 4-beat figure, but instead of being only ascending, like going up, only goes up, it actually goes up and then back down. Down, up, down. And this is believed by some to be associated or possibly having come from New Orleans, because there are some early music that used that. It's almost, that was using some Western music too, like that, the cowboy, it's like.
Surely.
So it kind of had that, kind of almost a Roy Rogers type of thing.
I've never associated it till this very moment. The gently riding on horseback and locomotive beats can be similar.
There is a gallop. Yeah, there's the kind of a gallop to it that can be rhythmically associated with either one. But Morse, the woman Morse, I forget zoning out, but the name of the Boogie Woogie piece that she did, it had that. But it definitely has this kind of lonesome Western feel, laid back, and it was definitely emphasized in the 40s. But at the time that Lee Sullivan showed to me, he wasn't playing it so much as a swing beat, just still 4-beat, but different from like that. And then there was another, I think this was probably, it was named after Hoxie the man. It was a railroad man, but there was a community south of Atlanta, which was not an incorporated community, but I think that's probably the geographical area where
between Atlanta and Jefferson.
Yes,
okay.
Yeah, it was in Cass County. It was like, I think modern day Bivens. Is there a Bivens?
Bivens, Linden, Kildare. Yes,
Bivens. I think the little community of Bivens is at the current location where Hoxie was at.
Where Hoxie was. Okay,
I'm pretty sure.
Okay, thank you.
But this is coming closer to the well-known Boogie Woogie bass figure, because you got that. You take that back down. You have another one, but that's much closer to the figures that are still being used in modern music than either the Marshall or Jefferson. And then another one, this becomes an 8-beat figure. This is essentially 2 4-beat figures or 2 Hoxie figures, Hoxie on the way up and then back down again. And this was believed to have been used or developed during the construction of the bridge over the Sulphur River. So maybe around September, October of 1873. But it's essentially, you take it up like the Hoxie and then down again either or. So. And that was called the Texas and Pacific bass figure. So now you're getting not specifically the name of a location, but the actual name of the railroad.
Got it.
In this case. And when you take that and double it up, if you did a double version, like an octave double version, it was essentially a variation of the Texas and Pacific bass figure, but with double octaves. It was called the Swampoodle bass figure, and I'll talk a little bit about where Swampoodle came from, but at least in this region. But that sounds like this is probably the most well-known Boogie Woogie bass figure of all time, at least using broken octaves. Like that. And of course, there are also others well-known that use just kind of like shuffles. Kind of shuffle figures, but as far as broken octave ones, the Swampoodle is definitely the most famous.
Swampoodle is to this day a section of downtown Texarkana, isn't it?
Yes, and that's where Lee Sullivan and others believe this bass figure to have been developed.
Okay.
Now, I've looked at old newspaper articles, and the word Swampoodle in published accounts. I don't think there's anything that I can find, if I remember, prior to like 1890, early 1890s. So the Swampoodle name was probably in use prior to its publication in newspapers, but it's also possible that this bass figure, that the doubling of that TMP bass might not have occurred until the 1890s. I'm not sure, but it is identified as having been developed in that area of Texarkana, which was known for a lot of piano music, and I think I mentioned it earlier in the presentation of the Rotary Club today that the Swampoodle district of Texarkana, on 2 different occasions, they outlawed piano music as well as Victrola music, because the piano music was so, but to some people at least it was a nuisance. I'm sure some people liked it, some people didn't.
If I may give a modern day footnote to our viewers, if you're a passenger on today's Amtrak Texas Eagle, train number 21 westbound, leaving Texarkana, right after you leave the environs of Texarkana Union Station, editorial comment, today's prison facility on the west end of the depot. Don't get me started on that. But immediately after you've left those environments of the original footprint of Texarkana Union Station, westbound, if you'll look to the right, you're looking at Swampoodle.
The little creek you cross over.
Yes. I don't know that the creek will be visible because it's so small. But if you'll just look to your right from the train as you're westbound leaving Texarkana, while still in the downtown area, that's Swampoodle.
The district, the neighborhood.
The neighborhood, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so that Swampoodle Creek, at one point it was maybe more crooked, but it was straightened up by a man named Joseph Deutschman. At least the part that's north of that track was much straighter, and then, of course, it's more naturally, serpentine south of that. But that whole creek essentially parallels the east side of the KCS tracks.
Yes.
So all up and down Elm Street, and even west of Elm Street, there was a Cedar Street in Texarkana. A portion of it might still exist, kind of north of downtown, but back in the day, Cedar Street, the Swampoodle Creek ran right down the middle of what was Cedar Creek, or Cedar Street, rather.
Let's continue.
Sure. Yeah, so that's a Swampoodle base figure, and let's see. So there were other railroads which had base figures named after them associated with Texarkana as well.
Yeah, Texarkana and Northern was a predecessor of the Kansas City Southern.
Exactly, and in fact, the earliest, from what I understand, the earliest right-of-way of that Kansas City to Texarkana right-of-way was actually developed here in Texarkana first before being subsumed into the larger KCS system.
Correct.
And let me see if I can, let's see. So that's, I think, a more sophisticated bass figure than it definitely is than the 4-beat ones. You're getting this distinct, 8 to the bars type of thing, and the octaves, as well as the chromatic. So it's definitely that beat or that particular figure is associated with Kansas City. So I think it most likely came out of Texas and went to Kansas City. Pete Johnson, among others, have figures that are similar to that.
It makes perfect sense. KCS, straight as the crow flies. Texarkana to Kansas City.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and it's a very efficient route by which itinerant music could have made it to the most efficient route by which itinerant music could have made it to Kansas City from Texas. And the Black Diamond is a bass figure that was associated, from what I understand, with a community that existed between, and it might still be considered Black Diamond community. I'm not sure if the name is still in use, but it was between Texarkana and Shreveport, which became a division ultimately of the Texas and Pacific Railroad. But I don't think it was actually part of the TMP in the early 1890s. I think it was still. Right?
It must have been a subsidiary because my great-grandfather, Wilbur Smith's father, was a locomotive engineer between Texarkana and Shreveport in the 1890s.
Okay.
On the Texarkana-Shreveport-Natchez Railway. And that was, I think I've mentioned earlier in the podcast, that was a mixed train, meaning carried passengers and freight. And it was locally known as the Rocket.
Interesting. Was it fast by local standards or just? No.
I think that was meant tongue in cheek.
They were being ironic. Okay.
I have several letters of my great grandfather back home on his Shreveport layovers where it was a full 10 to 12 hour day between Texarkana and Shreveport. But of course they were switching freight cars as well as picking up passengers. So,
and I imagine that the actual route of that track was like on ground that was maybe very shifty or maybe not very. It was closer to the Red River, right, than some of the other. It kind of paralleled the. Didn't it kind of parallel the Red River?
It did, yeah.
So there, I'm wondering if there was anything about the soil that was less.
That could be. I know that I heard my uncle Wilbur Smith tell many times about accompanying his father on the Rocket.
Interesting. And that, I think George Falk had something to do with that. It was one of the lumber industries that created that. Wasn't it like a lumberjack originally?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, So I think, and it did go through Falk or Boggy or...
No, it went right through Falk.
Right through Falk specifically, okay. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, there might have been a Boggy station like on the other side of Falk too.
Right.
In addition. But yeah, so there's a Black Diamond bass figure. The one thing I guess that distinguishes it is the use of a minor third and a major third depending on whether it's going up or down. So you could... I'm sorry, I'm saying it wrong. Hold on, I'm playing the wrong bass there. But that's the idea, is that basically you have this use of a minor third or a major third depending on where you're going up or down. So that's a little, that chromatic difference is a aspect of this figure that the others don't have, at least of the ones that Leroy Sullivan showed me. And another figure, these are ones, the Wascom is a town between Marshall and Shreveport.
Correct.
So it's going towards Shreveport, still in Texas. But This is interesting because it's an asymmetric. All the others were like constant stream of notes, even if they were played with a swung rhythm. But the Wascom is asymmetric because it has this one longer note and two shorter notes. So like that. And this figure actually can be heard in music like by Jimmy Yancey, who was not from the area, but who lived up in Chicago. But he used this particular figure. Now, whether he got it from Texas or not, I don't know. But it essentially was what's called the Wascom bass figure in the group of musicians that Leary Sullivan played with. Okay. And then the Greenwood bass figure is also asymmetric, and this is one that Professor Longhair used it. So this could potentially have this asymmetric bass figures could potentially have a New Orleans influence as well. But
for our viewers, today's Greenwood is located at the west end of Shreveport Regional Airport.
Yeah, so, in Louisiana, right?
In Louisiana. So if you're at the west end of the runways at Shreveport Regional, you're pretty close to Greenwood.
Thanks. Yes, exactly. So this was closer to, and also not far from Wascom as well. So instead of going down, it's got a. And you do hear some figures like that in Professor Longhair's music. So, not that Shreveport is New Orleans, but that it's closer to New Orleans and possibly more influenced by that sort of asymmetric rhythms. And even Jimmy Yancey, if you go back to that other note, that he talked about, actually, I take that back, not Jimmy Yancey, but rather Jelly Roll Morton talked about the Spanish tinge of jazz music. And he was more talking about this rhythm that bass figure, which is also another one that Jimmy Yancey used, but that figure in the context of Leary Sullivan's Boogie Woogie players was called the Shreveport bass figure. Once again,
wow,
closer.
That was a Shreveport.
Yes. So this is the one, and that's a ubiquitous bass figure used by Jimmy Yancey as well as maybe Professor Longhair at times as well. But you hear this a lot. But that asymmetry, the fact that it's not just about the bump, 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 bump notes, creates a lot of complexity.
I know you have it written in the slide there, but what you just played is certainly Floyd Kramer-esque.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, that song, what's the song? His Last Date.
Last Date.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. You definitely can sense on that in Last Date and a lot of his other music. And he played Boogie Woogie, proper Boogie Woogie too. So, but definitely. And I think he's either, I don't know if he's from Shreveport or associated with Shreveport. I want to say he might have been born in Shreveport, but he's identified strongly with Shreveport, actually, himself. So then if you move the other direction on the west side of Longview, you have a little community of Big Sandy, and this is a distinctive bass figure. This is not just a single monophonic bass figure. These are actually two notes at a time. And this is it could be regarded as a 4-part, or an 8-part. It's like, but the repeating figure really is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Although I have that written as a single measure, but it could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Now, whether that's simpler or more complex than the Marshall depends on whether you consider the combination of two notes to be simpler or not. But it's playing two the same thing, identical thing, then two more of the same thing. But basically they're each one, even though they're two of the same thing, is combining two notes. So it's more complex in the sense that it has two notes, but less complex because it's repeating two of the same thing. So it could be that this is a more primitive bass figure than the Marshall bass figure, but I don't know. But there's also another variation of that associated with Tyler, which is the same thing except the last two in this chromatic. And you also have another, it's not one of the 12 that Leary Sullivan showed me, but in a famous piece called The Fives, the Thomas Brothers of Houston developed, they had where they got it, then they got to slide down, and that's another famous figure is similar to that. So, and some of you might know the Tyler Tap Railroad ultimately became the St. Louis South. That became the Cotton Belt Railroad.
St. Louis Southwestern Railway. It certainly did.
Yeah. So that was and by the way, which went through Texarkana. So that was another route by which that could have come to be in Texarkana as well. And I said this before that the cows originally, according to Leary Sullivan, at least the cows was a motif, kind of right-handed embellishment to signify a cow being swept off the track by the cow catcher. So like that kind of thing, some kind of broken chord like that. But ultimately, by no later than 1940, in Downbeat magazine, they were saying the cows was the same thing as the Swampoodle bass figure. So ultimately, that's when you hear the cows these days, unless otherwise qualified, they're probably referring to that bass figure, which is the broken octave Swampoodle bass figure, which in turn is the broken octave version of the Texas and Pacific bass figure. So it kind of relates back to that. There you go. That's essentially what I said. The fact that they got conflated. I think it made more. It doesn't make sense to call that bass figure the cows when that was basically. It's hard to imagine that is representing or symbolizing a cow being swept off the track.
Yeah, to me, the right hand sounds the trebles. Cliff that you played sounds more like the cow being swept off the track. That the bass cliff sounds more like a cow lumbering along before it got hit. That's
true too. Yeah, that's true too. Although generally, pretty much all of the Boogie Woogie bass figures are identified with the train sound more so than any other event external to the track. But that's been used for like passing things, like passing a bridge or a post. And Meadlux Lewis's Honky Tonk Train Blues uses that sort of motif for that as well. But that's the slides I had, but there are lots of other things we could talk about.
Number one, in brief repetition, fascinating. Your attention to historical detail is so much appreciated by people who love history.
Thank you.
And thank you. The research is phenomenal.
Thank you very much.
Knowing you like I do, I wouldn't have suspected anything less than that.
It's been very obsessional.
Well, I think it has to be to get to the bottom line of things. There's history, and then there's license with history, and what we're trying to capture here is, to the best of our ability, the true story. Yeah. So. Tell us, what have I missed here? What have I not asked you about that should be asked?
Well, I mean, the more generalization I would make, just in terms of maybe a closing comment, would be that even though I focus predominantly on Boogie Woogie, the trains have influenced all sorts of music, and popular music in particular. And one notable recent example that you and I had discussed is the famous piece Texas 1947.
Yes.
By Guy Clark.
Yes.
And that is a piece that he talks about a red and silver streamlined train, but he says he saw this train in 1947 in Monahans, Texas. But when you look at the accounts, there's no evidence that the Katy Railroad, the red and silver streamliners, ever went through Monahans at that time, or even now, I guess.
Right.
However, the Texas and Pacific was running its early streamlined trains more on practice runs and VIP runs before they opened it up to passenger service. They were definitely running in 1947 through Monahans as far as El Paso, which photographic evidence shows. And so I think that Guy Clark has acknowledged that he used poetic license to change pennies to nickels when he talked about putting a nickel on the track, and acknowledges in an article that it was pennies, but that it worked better for the rhyming scheme to say that a nickel got smashed as flat as a dime, because that rhyme was streamlined.
Right.
And so that worked. And there's also, of course, you could have said a penny smash as flat as a dime, but there was another reason in the rhyming scheme that nickel worked better. And so it wouldn't surprise me if he, consider it's supposed to be this red hot train, almost this lady who's unavailable. She goes through town, she doesn't even stop.
Right.
The guys are just left there. Man, she didn't even stop, but they're still mesmerized by her. And so red is a hot color. Blue's not a hot color. It's a colder color, maybe a masculine color. So it fit I think the spirit of what he was trying to encompass with this streamlined train. But I think there was it seems very believable that the citizens of Monahans did come downtown to look at that train. But I think it was probably a T&P train.
Which, ladies and gentlemen, he probably is referring to the trial runs of the 1948 Streamlined Texas Eagle, which would have been blue, silver, and streamlined.
But in 1947.
In 1947.
Yeah,
because I think the historical record has established they were making trial runs with the equipment prior to 1948.
Definitely. There are newspaper articles with photographs of those locomotives in El Paso because they had just come from Fort Worth.
Right.
So they would have had to have gone through Monahans.
Right through Monahans. Yeah. Thank you for your time, for your expertise, for your knowledge. thank you for being a friend of Wilbur Smith's and one of his mentees. You know, whether you like it or not, you're getting the unofficial Wilbur Smith treatment of being the unofficial historian of East Texas. So whether you wanted to go in that direction or not, I'm afraid it's happening. I'm going to ask you to do something off the cuff, if you don't mind. We have a normal closing to each and every one of these podcasts, but I'm going to ask to make an exception in this case and not to do a normal closing of I've seen some trains before. Would you honor us and close us out with the Boogie Woogie piece of your choice?
I would be happy to do that. May I actually use a tuning system, which will be my choice. It would be an unusual tuning system, but it will take me just a minute to set it up. Can we edit that out? Would that be possible?
Well, we'll do it.
Is it?
Does this have a sound, or does this have a name, or are you improvising?
They're improvised, but for today, ladies and gentlemen, let's call it the Pitbull Boogie.
I'm on your team.
Okay. That's a coping strategy, right?
I like it.
Humor as a...
How about this? The Swampoodle Creek Pitbull Boogie.
There you go. I like that. It's
that
a long
I like.
title, but it works. And I don't have to necessarily... I can explain... No, I'm not going to explain it.
No,
It'll be an inside joke.
Inside,
okay. Y'all ready? Ready. Okay, this is improvisation. I'm going to call it the Swampoodle Creek Pitbull Boogie.
Love it.
Swampoodle Creek Pitbull Boogie.
Absolutely just delightfully incredible. Dr. John Tennison, thank you for joining us today and for your time and your graciousness. And you'll be back.
I look forward to it. Thank you. My dear friend, Griff Hubbard. Thank you, sir.
Through the heart of the nation, a traveling sensation. Get your reservation.